All right, welcome everybody to a conversation about the Cutting Green Tape Initiative. We have a great program in store for you today. I'm Annie Burke, and I have the honor and privilege of leading Together Bay Area. And I'm happy to be here with you all today and happy to co-host this webinar along with the California Landscape Stewardship Network. First, I want to start by acknowledging two things. One is that for thousands of years, people have called this place home. The Bay Area has been home to thousands of people and dozens of tribes and bands. We acknowledge that for 10,000 years, people have lived in harmony with these lands. We recognize the impact of colonization and Americanization have had on the lands and on the native peoples. We honor the indigenous people living today as well as their ancestors, and we deeply respect and admire and look up to their resilience and connection to the land. Guided by our framework for justice, equity, and belonging, Together Bay Area is working, taking action within our organization and with our members to honor and include and center indigenous people in their leadership, so thank you. I also want to acknowledge that we're living through an extraordinary moment. I know this has been said and a little bit cliche over the past year, but I just want to acknowledge kind of the hard, the sad, the scary, that it's been really challenging, that we're isolated. There's all kinds of things that I know you all know really well, but it's also a moment full of opportunity and potential. And that there's some really exciting things happening in our world also. So there's some challenging and some exciting, and that we're bringing all of that into today's conversation. And I want to share a quote from Sonia Renee Taylor that perhaps we can also share in the chat, Devin, if you wouldn't mind, that goes like this. We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. Those are words from Sonia Renee Taylor. So as I said, I get to work for Together Bay Area. And for those of you who don't know us, Together Bay Area is a regional coalition of tribes, nonprofits, and public agencies, all working for climate resilience and equity. Programs like today's is made possible because of our members. And so I want to give a lot of love and appreciation to our 67 member organizations. Some of you are here today, and thank you. One of our core values at Together Bay Area is transformation. We want to collaboratively transform how we live together on these lands, on this planet. And one way we do that is by harnessing the collective power of our members to secure significant amounts of public funding for climate resilience and equity through things like a climate resilience bond or a resilient agriculture bond, both on the docket perhaps for a 2022 ballot. We work very hard for the Coastal Conservancy and specifically their Bay program. But another way to transformational change is by making it easier to do the restoration and stewardship work that we need to do for climate adaptation and mitigation. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Today's conversation is all about cutting the Green Tape Initiative and how it can help us increase the pace and scale of restoration and stewardship. We're going to do our best to make this an interactive conversation. So thank you to everybody who submitted questions in the RSVP form. There were a lot of questions and they were really smart and great ones. Throughout our hour together, we're going to try to address what you've already asked, but we also invite you to submit questions here today in the Q&A function. And we'll do our best to answer them. Here on the Zoom stage, I'm with two Together Bay Area members, Kellyx Nelson of San Mateo County, excuse me, I always say it wrong, San Mateo Resource Conservation District, or RCD, and Sharon Farrell of the Gate National Parks Conservancy. They are both leaders in the California Landscape Stewardship Network and passionate spokespeople for the Cutting Green Tape Initiative. They're also passionate, intelligent, smart, focused members of the Bay Area conservation and stewardship community. And also with us today is Devin Landry, the coordinator of the California Landscape Stewardship Network, who we're co-hosting this session with. And he's going to help out in a few different ways. So that's who we are here on the Zoom stage. We want to know a little bit about who's with us, who else is here in this space with us today. So we're going to share a poll now in the chat. And you can click on that poll, on that link, and it hopefully will open up a new window for you in your browser. Devin will do a screen share in just a second with some of those results. And Devin, you're welcome to walk us through this if you'd like, or narrate.
Yeah, so it looks like people are getting the idea. Go ahead and point and click as to where you're zooming in from today. Hello from perhaps first and foremost, maybe from Boise or somewhere down in southwestern Idaho. Lots of folks coming in from the Bay Area, as you might imagine. Great to see someone up in the northern part of the state as well. And looks like we're rebooting here with all the responses coming in. So got some great statewide representation as well. Bulk of folks coming in from the Bay Area too, and maybe even some folks beyond state lines. So great to see everybody coming in.
Excellent. It's exciting to see so many people coming from all over.
Absolutely. On to the next question, Annie?
Yeah, let's do the next question.
All righty. So here in this survey style, just what you'd consider your main affiliation. Obviously, lots of folks working in partnership-based contexts, but what's the main hat you wear?
And for this one, you can do on the website, right? Or I see the text instructions up on the screen too. Is that, Devin, both work?
Yeah, so both work. If you stay at the URL that you're at and respond accordingly, then it should show up. And then if you are using your mobile, you can then choose A, B, C, D, E.
Great. Let's see who's here. Wow, a lot of nonprofits. That's great. About 48% nonprofits, public agencies, and special districts around 12% each, and about 20% consultants. It's fantastic. Really great to see that. All right, what's our next question?
Let me just get back to the next question here. And then similar style question, how familiar are you with cutting green tape? It's always fun seeing the answers come in real time.
Mm-hmm. You think you see it. You think you see the answer, and then it changes on you.
That's right.
Great. So about 50% are somewhat familiar, with some very familiars and some not familiar at all. Excellent. And this is the conversation for you.
That's right. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to stop my screen share here and give it back to Annie.
Great.
Well, thanks everybody for participating, and thanks so much for taking part in that little exercise.
Yeah, thank you, Devin, for helping out. So with that, let's start our program. We are going to turn it over to our speakers today, who I'll introduce one more time. They're going to talk about the initiative and share a bunch of information, but they're also going to integrate the questions that folks asked in the form. And we're also going to be in real time fielding questions from you. So while Sharon and Kellyx share about the initiative and about the work and thinking that went into it, please ask your questions in the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer them in real time. And so with that, Kellyx Nelson and Sharon Farrell, welcome.
Great. Thank you. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your afternoon to spend time with us. Kellyx and I thought about this, and we thought, you know what, you probably don't want to see one more PowerPoint presentation. For those of you that joined early, you got to see us dancing, and we are going to do something kind of in between dancing and PowerPoint, but we thought that we would do this as a conversation, like a fireside chat. And we can weave your conversation and your questions into the time that we're going to spend together in the next 45 minutes. So a little bit, let me just introduce myself. My name's Sharon Farrell. I work with the Gate National Parks Conservancy, and I lead our project stewardship and science programs. I wear another hat in that I help facilitate and direct a regional collaborative in Marin County called WANTAM. And then both Kellyx and I work together in the California Landscape Stewardship Network, which is really a network of networks that brings together these regional partnerships that are really focused on resource stewardship in ways in which we look together to how can we innovate solutions around some of the barriers that prevent us from working at scale at the pace that we need to, or with the practices that we believe will enable us to have durable relationships and durable change over time. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be, in some ways, the facilitator. I have the biggest armchair because I'm going to facilitate the conversation with Kellyx. And through this part that we're just going to narrate the story, the evolution of cutting green tape, the things that really help shape its report. Now we have a report, what are we doing next? So before I go into that conversation, I just want Kellyx for you to have a chance to introduce yourself, and maybe in your introduction, something people might not know about you as well.
Wow, something people might not know about me. Let's see. So here's something that people are likely to know about me is that I'm the executive director of the Resource Conservation District, or RCD, in San Mateo County. Through that, I participate in the Santa Cruz Mountains Stewardship Network, which is a member of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. So I've been engaging around this issue at different scales. Something people might not know about me. My first job in California was as a motorcycle messenger.
That's great. Well, why don't we kick it off? I mean, I think a lot of people have seen you around the state delivering webinars on this discussion around cutting green tape. What was the genesis of your involvement and the leadership that you've brought to the initiative itself?
You know, going all the way back to grad school, my master's degree was in public policy, and I was really interested in unintended outcomes of policy. And then in my restoration work, it's like time and time again, I kept coming up against this ironic barrier that the greatest barrier to my work restoring the environment, protecting the environment, kept being regulations that are intended to protect the environment. And there was something that was amiss. And there were a lot of conversations, a lot of people working on this issue that I encountered over the years. It was identified as a really significant priority in the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network. And then, as you can recall, Sharon, during one of our very first meetings of the California Landscape Stewardship Network, I brought this up as a priority from our region. And then all the other regions were saying, yeah, this is a really big concern and priority for us, whether they were private conservation lands, federal lands, state lands, just regular private property. It just was continuously a barrier. And so we brought it up in that group and identified that as a really like a #1 priority, or one of the highest priorities.
Right, and for those of you that weren't there, there were 6 collaboratives from around the state, ranging from Tahoe to Santa Cruz, from Wantam to down in Orange Coast. And we asked ourselves, like, when we think about the 2 highest priorities of areas that we need to begin to focus as a collective, one was around capacity building for networks. The other was around systems change, which is what Kellyx is referring to. And in that systems change, we were talking about regulatory efficiencies. And Kellyx, in that conversation, I remember you were incredibly passionate, and half the room basically said, this is an area of focus. And within thinking about that, you left the meeting and if I recall correctly, put pen to paper. I mean, what really inspired you then to take the first step to really begin to think about how to represent what you have just shared in the context of a white paper that could inspire change?
Right. Yeah. So it's true that the room was really supportive, and then they said, go ahead, go do it. So if I recall. And so then we really started thinking about like the different approaches that one could take to systems change and to removing regulatory barriers to restoration. And we identified 3 sort of buckets that they fit in. There are some solutions that are about, programmatic permits or programs that people can do. There's some that are legislative solutions like CEQA exemptions have been, or Habitat Restoration Enhancement Act. And then there was another bucket that was what we were calling culture, which was really about how people perceive and experience risk. And one of the things that I, as you can recall, started talking about a lot is that I feel like we've gotten to a time where the threats that we're facing are so big and so fast and so interconnected. They're like nothing we've seen before, and that whereas a lot of these regulations make sense if the risk is from taking action, we're facing a time right now where in our work, the risk is from not taking action, and that we needed to shift the paradigm about how we think about risk. And so, Jim Robbins from Almus Ecological and I and you then co-authored this white paper on shifting that paradigm. And we thought what we would do is we would assess what are the actions that have been taken since the early 2000s to remove regulatory barriers to restoration, just check in on the status of those and assess them. We thought this was a really wonky kind of navel gazing white paper.
Which it was.
And it was. But if we had known the level of interest it would get around the state, I think I would have, maybe put in some graphics and written it a little bit differently. But there was tremendous response to this across the state, and people were really hungry to continue having this conversation. So, that's when we brought that back to the California Landscape Stewardship Network, and we're thinking about how should the network engage with this? What might be the next steps?
Right, and I remember those conversations because I also remember that you were very thoughtful in saying that as we progress forward, we have to respect and honor that we're basically standing on the shoulders of giants, and we also know that there are multiple perspectives to this, and we did not want to be seen as trying to dismantle environmental protection, but really look at new ways of advancing large-scale beneficial restoration.
Right. Yeah.
And I think in that moment, we reflected like we were in a unique place. I mean, you described it as a perfect storm for being able to actually take that paper, take the content, take input around that paper, and bring it to another level. And so maybe you could describe a little bit about the perfect storm and then what happened as we came out of that storm.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, it has been a fear since the beginning that this would be perceived as dismantling environmental protections. And we had, I think, a recognition, like a real authentic, empathic concern about how different people would experience what we were talking about. We know, and we had many conversations. I mean, we spoke through the process, which we'll talk about presumably in a minute, with over 150 people. But in the beginning, there are people who've dedicated their lives to these environmental protections and are concerned about anything that appears to be threatening those protections, and people, agency staff who, write these permits, and people who've spent maybe 30 years of their career feeling that the buck stops with them about making sure that some, critter doesn't go extinct. And they don't feel like they have the luxury or the latitude to enter into some philosophical conversation that might undermine what little protections they feel that there are. And so the perfect storm really was, there were a lot of people talking about this. There are a number of groups working on this, like Sustainable Conservation is a real leader in this work. They've created a number of the tools that I use in my daily work to restore habitat. Brit was getting up and running in the Bay Area. Coastal Commission was having some of its conversations and doing its strategic planning. A number of folks were sort of navigating programmatic permits for their work. California Department of Fish and Wildlife was doing some like soul searching and writing up what they were doing. And then also Natural Resources Secretary Wade Crowfoot was really interested in what he could do. And I think there was a real opportunity with Secretary Crowfoot at a particular point that we didn't want to miss. And also people were getting really interested in the California Landscape Stewardship Network. And as Secretary Crowfoot has called us a coalition of the willing, like who is this group that isn't just lobbying me and advocating for things, and is also, kind of doing this additional work as volunteers in their spare time, yet covers 40% of the geography of California. I think that was intriguing. So I think that's some of the sort of perfect storm that went into the opportunities that we found.
And maybe you could describe then the process. I mean, you touched upon it with 150 participants, but the process we went through in partnership with the California Natural Resources Agency to create the report that is now out that really outlines the recommendations.
Sure. Yeah. So we were thinking about culture change. And what is it? Like, ultimately, we feel like this is an issue of culture, which is we perceive risk as taking action. And we don't have the systems and the culture in place, and culture is a barrier to systems change, to recognize that we need to be thinking differently about how to move things forward rather than how to stop them and evaluate risk. We still need to evaluate the risk, but there's something significant about which are you thinking of your end game as applying statute, or are you thinking of your end game as getting restoration done? And so we were doing that work. And during that time, Secretary Crowfoot had been hearing about the California Landscape Stewardship Network and invited us to come talk with him. So Sharon, you and I and Kevin Wright from Marin County Parks went and met with Secretary Crowfoot, and we were talking about our work. And we brought up this concern about regulatory barriers to restoration. And he basically said, I keep hearing about that, but what do you want me to do about it? And of course, we said, here's 4 things you could do today, and we'd like you to. And he said, I'll do you one better. I'll create a forum for you with the principals of different agencies and organizations and departments, and have them hear what you have to say. And he liked that our recommendations were, as he called them, actionable and surgical. And so Resources Agency ended up really owning this initiative. And during this time, Secretary Crowfoot also hired, there's a new position created, the Deputy Secretary of Biodiversity. Jennifer Norris was hired for that. And so we basically co-developed and facilitated a series of roundtables with about 150 participants around the state, and also a number of other conversations on the side that included agency staff, land trusts, public land managers, conservation organizations, environmental advocates, tribal representatives, private sector business representatives, et cetera, to try to get as many perspectives as we could. And the report that we ultimately issued this past fall is a set of 14 recommendations that reflects what we heard from all of you. Some of you who are here today were part of that process, and some were not. And it's basically, it reflects what we heard. And the recommendations are at very different scales because the work ahead appears to be at very different scales. Some things were just simply, look, the CEQA exemption exists. Let's use it. And let's use that as intended to make sure people are interpreting it properly. And other things were more along the lines of, we need an entirely new system, a new process, a new way to permit restoration, particularly if it's landscape scale going across multiple properties and land ownerships. We need ways to get that work done. So the recommendations are at different scales, different time horizons, some that are incremental and some that will require a lot more thought in terms of how to do it, recommendations for different actors. But because the opportunity was really with the state, and the initiative, the Cutting Green Tape initiative is owned by the Resources Agency, the focus was on what the state can do and regarding environmental regulations. So everything that affects restoration isn't included in that initiative, but that doesn't mean it can't be in the conversation. It's just not in the recommendations of that report.
Do you want to go, and Devin, if you want to put the report link in the chat, do you want to go, Kellyx, a little bit into, you went at a high level, but are there any recommendations that you think might be helpful just to go a little deeper into in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to it a little bit. I'd say that there are recommendations that focus on, well, first of all, the two recommendations that were by far the most common were an executive order from the governor and saying that we need to streamline permitting to do environmentally beneficial work, and inter and intra-agency coordination. And because those were so ubiquitous, we did not put them in as standalone recommendations because they really influenced or were influenced by all the other recommendations. So I should flag that. And then the governor's 30 by 30 biodiversity executive order that came out on October 7th actually includes cutting green tape. So we were thrilled to see that and that support. And then the inter and intra-agency coordination, I know that conversation is happening in a lot of different places. And then there are recommendations that have to do with interpretations of or amendments to CEQA, that some things that would require legislative solutions. There are a number of recommendations regarding the Water Board, the State Water Resources Control Board, both for the general order that they're currently updating and what we'd like to see in that update. And also with how water rights are processed for projects that benefit stream flow. And then some recommendations having to do with fish and game code or how fish and game, how it's administered. Also things like historically, the Fisheries Restoration Grant Program of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Also, that program is special in that with the funding also comes some programmatic coverage for a number of permits. And it used to be that projects that weren't funded by that program but advance the goals of that program could receive coverage of those permits. So we recommended going back to that. So these are some of the kinds of recommendations in that report. And I should note that because at all times we were thinking about culture, we really thought it was important that agency staff be able to have ownership of solutions. And so whenever there could have been something that was legislative or something that was programmatic, we defaulted to the first recommendation being that an agency or department would own the solution and try to advance it. Legislation could always come later. But one of the key findings for us really is that culture eats legislation for breakfast. That we've actually found a number of things in statute that are not implemented as they were intended, and that we all need to be rowing in the same direction and establish precedent and hold the flame for the intention of streamlining some of these efforts to make sure that policies are implemented as they were originally intended.
Right. I mean, who would have thought, right? When we first started that conversation in 2017 that we would be here today, and we're seeing conversations around cutting green tape in different ways. Right. And I think that it really is becoming more symbolic of like, how can we do things better? How can we improve our systems, the effectiveness of them, in order to be able to meet the challenges at the time? You look at right now with the Forest Management Task Force and the scale of which we're talking about managing our forests. It really begs the question of how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that's environmentally sensitive and meets that moment around climate, as far as the climate change issues that we face?
Yeah, Secretary Crowfoot, actually, he wasn't the person who said this. He quoted somebody else as saying this, but he at one point said that with climate change, winning slowly is losing. And, we feel, I think a lot of us feel a real desperation to be getting big solutions in now. And that we can't do business as usual and think that it's going to accomplish the solutions at the scale that we need them right now. We need big visionary actions. We need to be restoring these lands. And the fact is that restoration is not, it's not fencing land off and letting it be, because we've altered these landscapes. We've fragmented them. We're fertilizing them from our cars. We've changed our climate and there's a biodiversity crisis, et cetera. And so we need to be moving on this now and at scale.
I mean, even in our region, we're talking about, do we work at the national park scale, the one-TAM scale, the Golden Gate Biosphere scale? And the scale really relates to the challenges that we're facing and the goals of, what we can actually enact in relationship to land management. So I guess one of the things that comes to mind, right, as folks read this report, as they hear its evolution, how can people get involved, or how can they learn more? Part of this webinar is just that, right? It's a way just to open a conversation to learning more about the work.
Right. Well, one question I have for Devin, I see that Devin is putting some links and information in the chat box. Devin, I want to confirm for folks that if it's hard for them to, if they feel like, oh, this resource, I better check this out now, and then it takes them away from this conversation. I wanted to confirm that, or maybe with Annie, that anything that we're putting in the chat box will be sending to participants so that if they don't have to click on those links now. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's absolutely correct, Kellyx.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. So, boy, how can people get involved? One is that on April 6th is the first exchange that we're having with Resources Agency, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, State Water Resources Control Board, Sustainable Conservation, California Landscape Stewardship Network, and others. That has a format that really is very open, so that any of you or anyone who has a question about this or a particular interest or is advancing something that you want to talk about, there should be some opportunity for beginning to do that. And this is the first of this type of exchange, but there will be others. They'll continue. And California Landscape Stewardship Network is really committed right now to helping to ensure that these kinds of exchanges continue. The report was a particular point in time. It reflects a particular set of conversations, but it's not a contract, and it's not intended to stop anything that is emergent or any opportunity or ideas that people have. And there are others who are advancing solutions in different ways, including federal solutions. And that Cutting Green Tape initiative wasn't about the set of recommendations that were published, weren't about that. So participating in those, the California Landscape Stewardship Network has a webpage on Cutting Green Tape. The Natural Resources Agency has a webpage on Cutting Green Tape. There are some resources on Secretary Crowfoot's blog. People can contact me directly at any time. Gosh, Sharon, am I missing anything? Is there anything else that you can think of?
No, and I'm sure there's going to be others emerging as time moves forward, especially with the exchanges. I can envision that there may be offshoots of people being able to get involved in various aspects of the work.
That's right. This is a really emergent space right now, and a lot of people interested in engaging with this in really different ways. And so, this is really going to take a village. So there's no one entity that owns Cutting Green Tape as an effort. So anybody who wants to work to make sure that we're working better and getting things done at the scale that's needed or at the pace that's needed is part of this effort.
So there were questions that we received before, and there's questions that I'm already seeing coming up in the chat that I thought I would just weave into the conversation. I mean, some of them you've already answered, Kellyx, so we're answering as we're going along. One of the things I think that we're even grappling with is, how do we measure success? Like, what are some of the ways that when you take something as big as this, that you begin to contemplate, what does success look like?
Right. Yeah. One of the things is, I think that often when we talk about whether we're doing something to cut green tape, what we talk about is the effort that we're making, but not necessarily the outputs. So cutting green tape is it working? Part of that might be, yes, we set up this system or this interagency forum, or we have more staff on this, or we have meetings regularly, or what have you, but are projects getting done faster? Are projects able to work through complexities? Are we doing the most important projects, not just the ones that are the most feasible to get done during that funding window? I think these are some of the metrics that we should be thinking about and setting up.
And these are some of the conversations we're just starting to have right now, and we're really exploring whether it's be through case studies that help really amplify and bring to life what is working and what isn't, whether it is actually working jointly with those who are interested in state government to think about metrics that are additive, right? Because I think we all sometimes struggle with another set of metrics on top of the 6 sets of metrics we already are looking to. So how do we aggregate what we're already doing in a way that can tell that story better?
Right.
Another question that's actually in the chat, and I was just going to reflect on that one that's coming in from Robin, was, on very large scales, how do we keep this one size fits all with resources to understand the hyperlocal level and conditions? And I think that has been a part of just being a part of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. The beauty of being a part of a network of networks is you begin to understand the variation, the differences, the multiple purposes that each of the networks have around how they achieve and are seeking to achieve landscape scale stewardship. And one of the things when we first started our work was we were looking at how do we create greater connectivity between aspects of state government, those that hold the climate initiatives, the biodiversity initiatives, the forest initiatives. And while that's really important and true, I think what we've come to recognize, and we're spending a lot more time and thought around, is what are the ways regions can integrate as appropriate, pending their purpose, state goals in the local context, in the regional context. So how do we take all of these larger efforts and we regionalize them, for lack of a better word? And so that's a conversation that we're having a lot, because when you take the Southern Sierras compared to Santa Cruz Mountains and the North Coast Redwoods, we're all very different in both our resources and our approach, the communities that live within those areas. So it really isn't about one size fits all, but the concept of scale is one that I think continues to be one that we grapple with. Like, what is the right scale of which you do land assessment? What's the right scale for a restoration practice when you're working with systems? So I'm asking questions back, but I want to acknowledge that question is such an important question that many of us at both the state and national level are having conversations about how to maintain flexibility, but to bring accountability and kind of a container in which we, undertake this work. Kellyx, if you have reflections too on that.
I do, yeah, Robin. So for those who haven't seen in the chat box, her question was on very large scales, how do we keep from one size fits all with resources to understand hyperlocal conditions? And for me, what I think of is I want to make sure that we're working at the scale that fits the resource need. So for example, if there's a stream flow project, I don't want to work with just one farm on water management. I want to work at a scale that makes sure that we're restoring the creek stream flow, or also with creek restoration. If you're maybe a public land agent, like an open space authority, and you might throw everything at this stretch of creek because that's the part where you own, but some of the ecosystem process has to do with different upland parts and different downstream parts. How can we work at scale across different ownership to make sure that we're restoring, ecosystem process?
So I'm going to go between these like larger questions to more specific questions. So forgive me, Kellyx and everyone else, but I want to really kind of meet the moment with all of your different kind of levels of interest. So here's a more specific one. Excuse me. What is the status of potential changes to the Class 33 CEQA exemption to allow it to apply to more restoration projects?
What is the status of it?
Mm-hmm. Status of potential changes.
Yeah, well, I don't know if this answers this directly. So if I'm not answering it directly, please put in the chat box if I'm not, satisfying that. There was no shortage of discussion about CEQA during the roundtables and the development of these recommendations. Some people were concerned that if you open CEQA up, it's going to, it has a lot of uncertainty to it. You know, if you open it up legislatively, there's a lot of uncertainty to that, and that maybe people want to tinker with it for developers, and then maybe environmental advocacy groups will then not want to touch it at all. Basically, it was seen as like the third rail. But then there were also some folks who were saying that you can't really accomplish anything unless we address some aspects of CEQA. And it's, you know, that's where real systems change is going to happen. The recommendations regarding CEQA that you see in the report reflect many, many hours of that conversation about like, what is the right fitting CEQA recommendations to make right now that that are where the group ultimately landed as what seemed like what they were recommending now. And again, that was a particular point in time. And if our thinking about this emerges, then it'll emerge.
So one question, just in a more a reflection, like, you know, when you consider the last, I would say it's 2.5 years of your life that you have been really focused on this. I know you focused before, but let's just say that it became part of your family, so to speak.
All consuming, yes.
Yeah, all consuming. What have you learned? Like if you know, as you reflect, that like, what if I had said to you 3.5 years ago, you know, consider this as you move forward.
What have I learned? Boy, I've learned so many things. I'm sure this is probably not super helpful for all the people on the webinar, but I'm going to say it anyway. I've learned a lot from you, Sharon. I've learned so much from you about how to create and facilitate a process in a space that allows different voices to be heard. I've learned also that that this isn't a conversation you have once, it iterates. And that I've also learned that a lot of people enter the conversation wounded. You know, that whether it feels like it's the beginning, the middle, or wherever it is, a lot of people feel like they weren't at the table and it's painful for them, or that they feel like they're in the crosshairs. You know, I think that I've heard agency staff feel really attacked and not understood for their work, and that they are upholding very important mandates that protect the resources that we have. I've heard practitioners who feel really vulnerable, restoration practitioners who feel really vulnerable and misunderstood and not trusted in their work. So I've just been struck by how many like wounded feelings there are in all of this and how that really matters. Another thing that that I learned was it was really interesting going back and reading the Coastal Act, reading the Fish and Game Code, reading the Water Code, reading CEQA, not just the part that I needed, but going back and reading these laws and realizing how much that we wanted was already in there, and that it's not enough to have a law. A law is, for some of these things, necessary, but not sufficient. We have to keep it alive, that intent, and we have to keep having conversations.
You know, as you were reflecting on just how deeply, you know, folks felt about either a project that couldn't happen or just being misunderstood, I think that often relates back to our deep connection to this work and the passion in which we bring, which is a good thing I often reflect on.
Yeah.
So just as you're reflecting on just our colleagues who are working with state agencies, you know, one of the questions was, what more is needed at the state to support implementation? And then how do we as a restoration community help keep this both in the forefront, but the movement of the Cutting Green Tape initiative as part of the practice of working, you know, from this point forward in this type of work?
Right. You know, I think that we can challenge ourselves to be really good allies and partners to state agencies and departments, that when they need resources, we can advocate for them to have those resources in ways that they cannot. And, you know, like there are a number of champions right now in particularly, I think, in Department of Fish and Wildlife and in the State Water Board, who are really and some regional boards, that regional water quality control boards, that we should be supporting who really have vision and also a deep understanding of where the constraints are to accomplish systems change. Right now, I feel like the state is so supportive in many key ways. I also see that in my day-to-day work, I still keep encountering bureaucracies that don't readily embrace change. That's just not what bureaucracy is set up to do. And so, I think if we honor that there are needs around transparency, accountability, risk management, and that those are real needs, and there are needs for getting work done more at the scale and pace that's needed. If we don't set it up as opposites, but just recognize that these are all important needs and we need to navigate that together. My sense is that the state, that a number of key entities in the state are really amazing allies right now. And I think it's going to be important for us to make sure that, again, that there isn't sort of backsliding, that our systems or institutions don't end up co-opting these efforts so that they cease to function as intended. So we're going to have to, as a community, we're going to have to, I think we're going to have to notice when it's like little flames that pop up, and we need to, keep putting them out, or whack-a-mole or whatever it is, to make sure that there isn't backsliding to the advancements that are being made.
Right, and I think shining the spotlight on things that are working well. I mean, that's one of the things that the California Network is going to continue to do, and Alex, you've called these bright spots, but really profiling where there's direct action being taken, or ways in which we're doing the work that really is in alignment with the goals of cutting green tape and allowing us to do the work at scale. I mean, I think, we often will say we want to, at the end of the day, be able to work in partnership easier than we currently do, and we want to be able to work cross-boundary in a way that we're not challenged by all the current policies and guidelines. We're able to do it with new opportunities in front of us. And I don't know, maybe go ahead.
I was just going to say, the conversation that we're having, cutting green tape is essentially a new branding for this, but in no way is the work that we're doing something that's utterly new, right? I mean, as you said earlier, Sharon, I always talk about the fact that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. I myself am a fan of sustainable conservation, and hopefully many of you are out there, and some other groups that really have been doing this work. In the early 2000s, Secretary Nichols issued a paper on removing regulatory barriers to restoration that had a set of recommendations that resulted in the CEQA exemption for small-scale habitat restoration, and a number of other things that we assessed now 20 years later in our initial white paper. So this isn't new. I think what we're doing now is we're starting to reinvigorate that and to connect the dots where people feel alone, and try to support the state and support practitioners and continue to hold the conversation, and try to advance that conversation and keep the momentum going, connect some dots.
Right. So there's another question that came up in the chat and the Q&A. It really is around like our conversations we've been having with Fish and Wildlife and others about the Cutting Green Tape initiative, specifically around the Endangered Species Act and fully protected species. And the question is, there are, basically asking around, are the projects stalled due to take prohibitions or permitting requirements, even though the habitat of the species would likely be improved? Has this been a part of the conversations that we've been involved in?
Yeah, that question is kind of broad brush, which I can appreciate. But I'm immediately wondering specifics about what these projects are. So setting fully protected species aside for a moment, just CESA, California Endangered Species Act, depending on the size of the project, or what its eligibility is it eligible for Habitat Restoration Enhancement Act, which helps facilitate CESA requirements, and some other streamlining tools. By the way, I recommend another resource is to go to Sustainable Conservation's website that where they have a lot of information about the tools that are already in place. There are some recommendations in our report that have to do with CESA. And HREA right now, the Habitat Restoration Enhancement Act, is set to be renewed. And I'm sure that if that's something that you support, this is a good time for you to write letters of support about that. And maybe we can follow up with people about that as well. Fully protected species. Oh boy. There were a lot of conversations about that as well. And there are some new potential tools that are in development around that. I probably won't get into huge detail right now, but I'd be interested in having a follow-up conversation with who posted that if they want to contact me.
Great, thank you. And one question that several folks have asked is, where do we hope that we'll be 2 years from now with this initiative? Or what brings you hope with what you've been a part of to date and what you see in the future?
What brings me hope right now is the level of conversation that's happening about this. I feel like we're shifting from something that I think has been really positional and something that is more broadly embraced. I hear California Department of Fish and Wildlife, when they're giving their webinars, they own cutting green tape. It's their initiative. I hear Resources Agency, they own it. It's their initiative. I hear, people who are doing this work in different ways. I see shifts happening. I also feel a lot of hope that it was included in the executive order. Like that's a level of support for this that we haven't seen before. And that it's one of the 4 tenets of the Resource Secretary's administration. Like that's just a level. I'm seeing it at different levels. And then Secretary Crowfoot's memo that went out in January to all the leadership of all the departments and folks within Resources Agency, basically saying, thou shalt report back to me on your progress on these things. That gave me some hope. And we've done now a number of these webinars, and often these webinars have, a couple hundred people. There's a real hunger to do this work. So I feel like there's diffuse ownership. Along with that, I think is going to be a challenge for us to row in the same direction. And one of the things that we heard from agency staff was, just as it's difficult for restoration practitioners to have maybe 7 to 9 different local, state, and federal permits for a restoration project that say different things or measure in different ways. Is it acres or stream length or, what have you? What we've heard from agency staff is it's really hard for them to accommodate our needs when we, as a restoration community, have different people asking these questions in different ways with different metrics all the time. So I'm hopeful about these conversations so that we can begin to make our requests in a more coherent, organized fashion so that we can get our needs met more readily.
Thanks, Kellyx. And I know we're coming closer. I see there's a comment from Stephanie Falzone that sustainable conservation can provide people with a template support letter for SB 716. Yes, thank you, Stephanie, for bringing that up. Contact us at restoration@suscon.org. Support letters for the hearing set on April 15th. They're due by April 2nd. So really appreciate that. And maybe you could post that in the chat too, just so folks have that email address. Thank you.
Yeah, if they're due by April 2nd, that's 2 days from now. So people want to get on that.
So I know we're coming close to the end. It's, 1:54. Anything else you would like to add before we turn it back to Annie? It's always a pleasure having time to talk. Usually we get to do it in person, and for today we're on a Zoom, but I hope this has also been for those folks who are joining us just to hear more about the story, some of our own reflections. The report has a lot of meat, and Kellyx is generously offered and continues to be a resource to individuals. And if we can't answer a question, we're happy to link you to someone else. So any closing thoughts, Kellyx, before we turn to Annie?
There was one question that had come in that I wanted to make sure that we answered, that somebody had asked beforehand, and I wanted to make sure we touched on it if there's a minute for that.
Yes.
Somebody had asked a question, I think, before the webinar about SB 901.
Yes.
So SB 901 in the forest practice rules and so the question was, is the state going to renew the SB 901 exemption that allows forest restoration activities already approved by NEPA to qualify for a CEQA exemption? And so I wanted to be transparent about the fact that I'm no expert on forest practice rules or anything. I'm a generalist, certainly. But I never understood this to provide a CEQA exemption. I've heard people say that, but I've never understood that to be true. My understanding was that this provided an exemption from a THP requirement, not from CEQA, and that because THP is like a CEQA equivalent, people say it was a CEQA exemption, but that's not what I always understood. But I don't know for sure. But that said, I don't know whether they're going to renew SB 901. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball and I don't know much about what the conversation has been about that. So if there's anybody on the line who does, you could go ahead and put it in the chat box if you can answer that better than I could.
Great, thank you. And Devin's going to also post the link to register for April 6th, which is the exchange with the California Natural Resources Agency, which both Secretary Crowfoot and Deputy Secretary Norris will be a participant in. So Annie, turning it back to you.
Well, thank you both so much for this. One of the big takeaways that I have from this conversation, and having heard you present before in many different forums, is that it's really about culture change. And in that culture change, we're talking about transparency. We're talking about reassessing our understanding of risk and risk of action and risk of inaction. We're talking about collaboration across landscapes, across jurisdictions. Is there anything else, just kind of in our closing time here, that you would say are like the key elements of what that cultural shift is? Either one of you, and maybe Sharon, since Kellyx has fielded a lot of questions. I wonder, well, and either one of you, if you'd like to jump in on that question.
I mean, I think you mentioned it with around collaboration, relationship building.
Yeah.
And being able to listen. I mean, I think oftentimes coming into the conversation and understanding perspective, and not so much trying to counter that perspective, but looking for new ways of thinking. I think doing that throughout this work has opened new doors, opened new language to how we talk about it, and bringing shared ownership. That was so much around our roundtable process, because there were many different perspectives in those conversations.
Yeah, I was going to say lead with empathy. Everybody is just doing their best. and most of us, no matter which perspective, wherever we're working, what angle we're working from, are feeling kind of depleted. So I think just bringing empathy is really important.
I think one other thought, just because I think of Together Bay Area, having collective voices at the right moments in time help shift obstacles and allow for the ability to begin to have conversation where it might not normally exist.
Great. Well, with that, thank you both so much. And please, everybody listening and watching, please join me in thanking Sharon and Kellyx for their leadership, their out-of-the-box thinking, for their empathy. Thank you to Devin for helping do some behind-the-scenes wizardry. And thank you all for the work that you're doing to transform how we live together on these lands and in this place. It does take all of us, and we are working together to do that work. So thank you. We started this webinar with music, so we're going to end this webinar with some music. Please join me in some, in some happy music, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for coming.
Sunshine, she's here, you can take a break. I'm a hot air balloon that could go to space.
Send you off to your afternoon.
With the air, like I don't care, baby, by the way.
We should end all meetings this way.
Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Here come bad news, talking this and that.